So the good thing about independent bottlers like Signatory, like MacPhail, it gives you access to distilleries that you can't normally buy off the shelf because they don't sell their own whiskey, or also you might get a whiskey that is marketed or sold by the distillery, but the format's been changed a little bit, and we're going to taste something like that later on. So what we wanted to do is just start here on the history of Scotch, and just theirs goes back to 1494, King James IV, Aqua Vitae. Aqua Vitae is Latin for all my scholars out there. It means water of life. Over time, Aqua Vitae was translated in Scottish Gaelic to Uisciba. Uisciba became Uisci, Uisci became whiskey, thankfully, right? So it's a lot easier to say and pronounce. So we're going to taste some great old whiskies later on, whiskies from distilleries that have been around for centuries. But what we wanted to do was showcase a young distillery. The distillery was only built in 2017. Its history goes back to 1494. This is Lindores Abbey. This distillery, Lindores Abbey, is built on the site of Lindores, where they reckon Friar John Call lived, right? So it's only been going, 7 years now, 8 years. But what they've done is they've produced this whiskey, this 1494, which is the first whiskey you've got. And for me, they've produced this very bright and fragrant, very approachable, very easy to drink whiskey. And what I love about this is there's the perception that older is better. That is not the case. Older is more expensive. That is the case. This whiskey does not have an age statement. It's approximately 4 to 4.5 years old. You've got to be a minimum of 3 years to be a Scotch whiskey legally by law. But this is a great example, right, where they've really tried to develop a whiskey that's matured young, right? For example, the fermentation's 117 hours, right? It's nearly 5 days. Typically, you're just over 2 days average fermentation in Scotland. Super long fermentation gives you a light, fruity whiskey. They also have 2 spirit stills, very unique. So rather than a wash still and 1 spirit still, they've got a wash still and 2 spirit stills. Why do they do that? It's effectively doubling the amount of copper that's interacting with that new make spirit. What does that do? Produces a light, fruity whiskey, right? So really enjoyable, right? So it's a really nice whiskey, and I wanted to showcase that because I know how hard it is to open a distillery. It's even harder to open a Scotch whiskey distillery, right? You have to wait 3 years. So this is Lindores Abbey. It's a lovely whiskey, very enjoyable. 1823 is up there because really that's the point where whiskey making in Scotland went from illegal to legal. Everybody was distilling illegally, and that's why most of the distilleries are in Speyside in the Highlands, right? Think of it, the taxman lived in the cities in Glasgow and Edinburgh, so everybody head up north, in the mountains, in the hills, with their small stills making illegal whiskey. So the landowners eventually said, right, let's cut this out. So they brought in the Excise Act, and you were given a choice. You can remain illegal, have a little still, hide, do that, or you can become mainstream, build a bigger distillery, pay taxes, but make more money. So you'll probably see a lot of when whiskey distilleries were established in Scotland was 1823, 1824, 1825, right? Because this Excise Act transitioned from illegal distilling to legal distillery. Really, when it took off, late 19th century, there was a little aphid called phylloxera, it came from America actually, and it destroyed the vineyards in France. Everybody was drinking wine, everybody was drinking, brandy, and suddenly there was no more wine, no more brandy to drink. Did people stop drinking? No. Correct. They looked for something else. So those canny Scots went, I think we've got something for them. So they created a lighter style of whiskey, and this was blended Scotch whiskey. It was light, it was easier to drink, it was mixable. Prior to that, single malt was very robust, quite fiery, and not that palatable. So they created blended whiskey, and they were able to do that because of the invention of something called the coffee still. The coffee still was invented by an Irishman. Yeah, that's all right. No, I'm just kidding. So a coffee still is a continuous form of distillation. It allows you to produce a lighter style of whiskey, continuous, so you can produce it in big volume. So you mix a lighter style of whiskey that made called grain whiskey. You mix that with the more unctuous, the more robust single malt, and you got blended Scotch whiskey. And that's what took off. That was the light of James Sheavis, Johnny Walker, right? They filled that blend, and that's what took off. Blended Scotch. That's why Scotch is where it is today. And all the distilleries that were built in the late 19th century were built to produce whiskey that went into blended Scotch whiskey. Nobody was drinking single malts late 19th century. Everybody was starting to drink blends. So a lot of distilleries were built purposely to provide whiskey to blends. You didn't know who these distilleries were. They weren't selling it. They weren't marketing it. They didn't bring out their own bottle. Basically, they were feeding the machine blended Scotch whiskey, right? Because that was the drink of choice. That's why it became so popular worldwide, was the advent of the blended Scotch. So, the whiskey barons, that's the likes of Johnny Walker. Johnny Walker started in 1820. He had a grocery store in Kilmarnock in Ayrshire, 15 minutes from where I grew up in Glasgow. Basically, it was like a corner store. He used to sell teas, foods, then started making his own whiskey, buying his own whiskey and then blending it. And now Johnny Walker sells, 20 million cases a year, right? That's blended Scotch, right? And then later on, we start moving to the point where single malt became the whiskey, and that was really late 60s, part of Gordon MacPhail, the 70s with Glenfiddich, really to the 80s, 90s that single malt became the preferred tipple. And now today, I run into people going, well, I don't drink blended Scotch, I only drink single malts, right? So we've kind of come full circle, and what's kind of ironic, the single malt whiskey distilleries would not be in existence today if it wasn't for blended Scotch, because that's where they sold their whiskey to. They sold it to the blenders. So, Gordon MacPhail, 1895, 130 years in business. Fourth generation, right? So 1895 they started. They weren't the first independent bottler. There was a bottler called William Cadenhead out of Aberdeen. He was about 1852. So this is a kind of unique concept in whiskey and in the spirits, is independent bottlers. Independent bottlers don't distill, they effectively acquire whiskey, mature it, then bottle it and market it themselves. All right? And this is Gordon MacPhail, started by James Gordon and John MacPhail. And they've, over their time, have relationships with over 100 distilleries, because a lot of them, as they weren't marketing themselves. So it was a great outlet, great way for these distilleries to sell whiskey. Here is an example of the word independent bottlers gets used for all types of independent bottlers, but there's two types, okay? You've got the traditional independent bottler who goes to the distillery and goes, Mr. Glenlivet, I want to buy a cask. No problem, sir. Sells you a cask. The independent bottler takes that cask, either keeps it at Glenlivet or takes it to their own warehouse, lets it mature, maybe might switch the cask, maybe do a finish, but effectively they buy the whiskey by cask. That's type 1. Type 2, and this is more like Gordon MacPhail, they actually buy the spirit and then they put that spirit into their own casks, right? And over doing this 130 years, they have got a skill set now where they match the spirit to the wood, and they've just learned this over many years. So they do it slightly different. So they get the spirit, put it in their own casks, mature in their own warehouse, and then they bottle it. So kind of two types. On the left, you could say, like tonight, we're going to taste Signatory. That's how they do it. And on the right, that's how Gordon MacPhail do it, right? But they're both regarded as independent bottlers. So this is Milton Duff. And this is classically what Gordon MacPhail does, right? This is part of the Discovery series. Great series, right? Not only do they come in a purple tin like this, which you can't miss, but what's great about the Discovery series is they've effectively classified into three main flavour profiles: sherry, bourbon, and smoky, right? Which are kind of your three main categories of Scotch whisky. So hence the name Discovery. It's a great way to kind of discover what you like, what you don't like, and kind of from there, it provides a conduit to open up. This is matured in sherry cask, so this comes under the sherry. So the Discovery series, you may change the distillery, but there will always either be sherry, bourbon, or smoky, right? So the distillery might change, but this is the sherry. This is Milton Duff. Actually, it's on the River Milton, and one of the owners was called Duff, hence the name Milton Duff, right? This is a 10-year, okay? Like all independent bottlers, non-chill filtered and no colour added. No colour added, what does that mean? Well, legally, by law, Scotch Whisky Association can add caramel colouring. It's not to add any kind of flavour. If people hear the word caramel and go, well, that's flavour, right? It's more to do with colour and colour consistency. What they want is the colour of the whiskey to be consistent, bottle in, cask out, year in, year out. So they're legally allowed to add caramel colouring to give consistent colour. Independent bottlers don't do it, which is the big appeal of independent bottlers. Also non-chill filtered. Again, this is a cosmetic thing, kind of. Whiskey under 46 ABV can become hazy. Some people call it Scottish mist. If anybody's been to Scotland, they'll probably know what Scottish mist is. It's the weather, right? But seriously, it's when whiskey gets cold, whether temperature or whether or not you use ice, your whiskey can look a bit hazy, a little bit misty, and people go, oh, there's something wrong with my whiskey, and they want to take it back, right? There's nothing wrong with the whiskey. It's just the separation of esters and proteins and from the water, from the whiskey. So that's why it's done. So what they do is the chill filter. They lower the temperature of the whiskey, pass it through some filters, and they hold on to these fatty acids, these proteins. People don't like that because they feel that gives you some mouthfeel, which it does, right? Proteins and esters give you some mouthfeel. So that's what independent bottlers don't do. And also because by bottling at cask strength is typically 46 ABV or higher. Now we're moving on, right? This was the Discovery range, which is kind of their exploration and kind of entry into the independent bottlers. Now we move on to the Connoisseur's Choice. I'm just a huge fan of these frame boxes, right? They kind of frame these incredible whiskies. And these incredible whiskies, all the information, the story of the whiskey's on the label. When it was distilled, the name of the distillery, when it was bottled. So another thing about independent bottlings, a lot of them are single casks. So you might be drinking or buying a bottle that's one of 200, one of 400, one of 500. It's not one of thousands, it's not one of millions. And that's what people enjoy about independent bottlers, right? So you might have a lot of people out here, maybe you've drank Glenlivet 12, right? Glenlivet 12 is the most popular single malt in America. But here's an opportunity to taste the Glenlivet on a slightly different format, right? We're kind of taking you down that normal Glenlivet path, and then we're going to just take you off on a wee fork off to the side, right? We're going to get you something that's not chill filtered, right? There's no colour added. It's a higher ABV. It's older, right? So again, for you 12-year Glenlivet fans, here's something a little bit different, right? Distilled back in 2004. I mean, what other product do you buy or consume that takes 10 years to make? So Connoisseur's Choice was started by Mr. George Urquhart. He was the grandson of John Urquhart, who took over Gordon MacPhail in 1915. He joined the company in 1895. So the current owners and fourth generation family members are the Urquharts. So their grandfather was Mr. George is his name, and he started the Connoisseur's Choice series back in 1968. And that was really kind of highlighting single malts, before single malts were really a thing, before they were really marketed. Glen Spey. So we're going to stick on the Connoisseur's Choice, okay? Again, kind of like this darker kind of grey frame packaging. This is the Glen Spey. Again, Glen Spey, right? You're like, Glen Spey? What's Glen Spey? Right? You don't see it on the shelf. Who's Glen Spey, right? Goes into Ballantine's, right? It's a single malt that feeds into blended Scotch whisky, all right? 2007 to 13 year. And again, 58.1 ABV, right? So when you taste these whiskies, when you pour it, it's incredible. I did a tasting last week and somebody drank a taste of whiskey and it was 116 proof. And if you taste a Scotch whiskey like you're tasting tonight, 116 proof, and then maybe compare that to a bourbon or an American whiskey, 160 proof, just a difference, right? Big difference in how that proof and ABV translates into taste and flavour. Scotch whiskey is a slow cook, right? We take our time, we're not in a rush, because of weather, because of climate, and because we don't use a lot of new casks. It just takes longer for the whiskey to make, and that's the thing. That's what we want. There is no substitute for time. It's a slow bake. Here in the US, using new wood and with the higher temperatures and climate, you get a lot of your flavour, a lot of the colour happening in that first year, right? So again, in Scotland, we tend to lose ABV. Here in the US, because of evaporation working in reverse, you tend to gain ABV, right? So hence why. Exactly. Hence why you tend to get higher ABVs, 120 plus proof bourbons, right? A lot of the independent bottlers, a lot of the single malts that you're going to taste is going to come from the Speyside region of Scotland. There's a reason for that. There's 5 whiskey regions in Scotland. Speyside is approximately 50 of about 150 distilleries. So if you go to Scotland, or not if, when you go to Scotland, you want to go to Speyside, right? You're going to get your most bang for your buck in this Speyside, which is why a lot of the independent bottlers, the distilleries come from Speyside, because again, a lot of the distilleries in Speyside were built specifically to supply whiskey to the blended Scotch industry. And a little tidbit, one of the other whiskey regions in Scotland was Campbelltown. Campbelltown is just about on the opposite side of Scotland, away down in the southwest. It was the whiskey capital of the world at one point. It was the epicenter. And then it just, for a couple of reasons, just fell off a cliff, right? One was due to quality. The other two was the most important point, was transport. They were making all this great whiskey, but the blenders were in Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is in the central region of Scotland. So how do you get your whiskey from Campbelltown to Glasgow? There's no train. boats take a long time. So up in Speyside, what did they do? They built a railway line. So you could send ingredients to the distilleries, and then once the whiskies were matured, you could put them on the train, send them down to the blenders in Glasgow and Edinburgh, who blended the whiskey and then sailed it out. So a logistical reason why Campbelltown fell away, and at one point was the number one. It was the second whiskey region I've mentioned, Speyside, Campbelltown. We've got the Lowlands in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where I'm from is Glasgow. We've got the Highlands, which surrounds Speyside. That's the largest whiskey region. And then you've got probably the one that's the most pronounced, one that probably really has its own kind of terroir for my wine drinkers out there, and that's Islay, right? Just because there's a big emphasis on using peat in their production, right? And they've kind of stayed to the traditional way that all whiskies at one point were made in Scotland, right? Before gas and electricity, everybody was using peat, right? It was just a form of fuel in Scotland, right? Scotland's a wee bit like Wyoming, right? There's not many trees, right? So we didn't have firewood. We dug up effectively coal from the ground, and that was semi-carbonized, decomposed plant material, and that is peat, right? He's not a person. Glen Spey, you are not going to see that on the shelf as a Glen Spey. You'll have to find it and access it through independent bottlers, the likes of Gordon MacPhail. So we're now going to move on to the other main independent bottler for the evening. This is Signatory. Signatory was started in 1992 by a gentleman called Andrew Simonton, and his first whiskey cask that he bought was a Glenlivet. And so Signatory is an independent bottler, and we're going to try a brand new range to the US. It's been in Europe for a couple of years. This is the 100 proof collection. 100 proof in Europe is 57.1 ABV. 100 proof in the US is 50 ABV. What I love about the 100 proof collection, and I saw a sign over here I was going to steal. Here we go, I grabbed it. Right, it's kind of like our version of Bottled and Bond, right? So Bottled and Bond, 1897, was established here in the US because some people were mucking about with the whiskey, the bourbons, right? What are the rules of Bottled and Bond? Has to be made at one distillery. Craigellachie, tick that box. It's got to be bottled at what ABV? What proof? 100, tick. It's got to be distilled at one season. This was back in 2007, and it's got to be transparent in all the information. And that's effectively, I kind of joke, it's our version of Bottled and Bond. But this is the great thing about independent bottlers. All the information's on the label. Now, it might be confusing to some people, but for some people who want to know when it was distilled, where it was distilled, the type of cask, the ABV, that sort of thing, that's what independent bottlers give you, right? And that's the beauty of them, right? So this comes from Craigellachie. Craigellachie is in the heart of Speyside. This is a 17-year-old. Craigellachie uses worm tubs. It's quite a sulphurous new make spirit. It tastes quite heavy. It is a new make. But then over time, it really transitions into this very light and fruity, almost tropical pineapple notes people pick up in Craigellachie. But this is a 17-year matured and first fill Oloroso sherry butts. This comes in the black label, tagged exceptional. The owner of Signatory, Andrew Simonton, regards certain casks, certain bottlings that he produces as being a wee bit special. And the 17-year is a wee bit special in Alistair's words, but to Andrew's words, he uses the word exceptional. Now we're going to move on to another Signatory independent bottler. We've got this one from Edgewater, and this is quite special in that Signatory started in the early 90s, but in 2002, they bought a distillery. And they bought the Edgewater distillery. So now the Edgewater distillery is the spiritual home of Signatory. So it's where Signatory has the warehouses that they keep all their casks that they've bought from the different distilleries they've bought, and it's where they've got their own bottling line. So Edgewater now has, not only makes its own whiskey, which it bottles and markets as Edgewater, but it's also the home of Signatory, right? So is the smallest traditional distillery in Scotland. So Edgewater for me is a massive whiskey produced by a pint-sized distillery, right? This is the Edgewater first fill sherry butt. What does that mean? This is its first fill of whiskey into a barrel that previously held sherry. You'll sometimes maybe see second fill or third fill. Basically, it just tells you how many times it's been used to fill with whiskey. After a period of time, the wood will become exhausted. In other words, it will no longer give flavour or colour to the whiskey, in which case we will either try and rejuvenate it. And how will we do that? We will shave some of the interior wood off, rechar it, retoast it, and give it a new lease of life. If you've met anybody from Scotland, we are very careful with our money, all right? So the ability to get another couple of tons out of cask, we will definitely do that. We will do that to a point where it either gives us no more flavour or no longer becomes watertight or whiskey tight, because we don't want the staves to go that thin that it can't hold the whiskey. Talking about places to visit, Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in the United Kingdom, all right? So it's only approximately 4,000 feet. I used to live in Colorado and people go, we've got mountains 14,000 feet. Yeah, well, the trailhead starts at 12,000 feet, right? That's a 2,000 elevation gain, right? Here at Ben Nevis, you're going from sea level to 4,500 feet, right? So it's the tallest mountain in Scotland, and it's the tallest mountain in the United Kingdom. It's Ben Nevis, right? And I say this, one, because it's a cool mountain, right? Beside the town of Fort William. But it's also, for me, this is a really old school whiskey, Ben Nevis, right? It's very traditional in how it's made. It's actually owned by Nikka, Japanese whiskey company. They've owned it for many years. Very traditional, uses kind of old wooden washbacks, uses a brewer's beer yeast. So very old school, slow fermentation, slow distillation. So very rich, very robust. You don't see Ben Nevis do not market and sell their own single malts. So again, great opportunity for you to try a whiskey that has a great reputation among people who enjoy independent bottlings. Ben Nevis whiskies tend to go quickly because people appreciate it, right? Here's our working museum, as I mentioned. I don't want to sell it too much because unfortunately you can see it from a distance. You can't go in and visit. And that's Edgehill, right? 1825, it was established. Officially didn't become named as Edgehill until 1837, right? It's in the heart of Scotland where whiskey distilling, illicit whiskey distilling was rife. Edgehill, this is the last whiskey. So if you think of like Bruichladdich got Octomore, Springbank has Longrow, they are basically distilleries that have a peated version that comes under a different name, different moniker, just to keep it separate from the unpeated. So this is effectively Edgehill's peated. So this is Balakin. Balakin was the name of a peated whiskey that was made in this area. Alfred Bernard, who was one of the first whiskey writers way back in the day, prior to Michael Jackson, didn't get a chance to talk about Michael Jackson, from Lindores Abbey, but Alfred Bernard visited the Balakin distillery. So this is Edgehill's 10-year. This is about 50 to 55 ppms, parts per million, so this is a peated whiskey. It's not the highest ABV, but it's probably the most intense from a peated point of view, hence why it's the last whiskey of the night. So this is matured for most of the time, effectively about 9 years in ex-bourbon casks. Then effectively, as Andrew would say, it's kind of topped dress with an Oloroso sherry cask. So effectively, he's transitioned the whiskey from maturation in bourbon to a short time in Oloroso, just to give you pull in some of those rich nutty notes from the Oloroso sherry to kind of combine with those more sweeter vanilla notes coming from the bourbon. So it's the best of both worlds. This is a phenomenal whiskey. It's kind of got this lovely kind of earthy smoke, which I really like. For me, smoky whiskeys, peated whiskeys have to be balanced, right? Yes. I don't like anything with the word bomb in it. It's not kind of balanced, right, for me, but that's just me. I like this. It's lovely, it's earthy, it's smoky, and it's a lovely finish to the night. Thank you so much. Thank you.